appears that we do.
Yeah, let's get,
Item 13, consideration of rescinding ordinance number 6592 due to the prospective bidder failing to fulfill the necessary requirements in order to complete the adjudicated property sale.
so move,
Go
so
ahead,
move.
Mr. Hunter.
Second.
I've got a motion by Mr. Guillory and a second by Mr. Hunter. Is there any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. Item 14, consideration of adopting a resolution approving the following request. A, ratifying the submittal of local government assistance program grant applications on behalf of special service districts to the Louisiana Office of Community Development on a project-specific basis. B, execution of agreements with the Louisiana Office of Community Development for said grant awards. And C, execution of sub-recipient agreements with said special service districts for grant awards.
Move on 14, all bullets.
Second.
Had a motion by Mr. Brame on all bullets and second by Mr. Collins. Is there any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. Item 15, consideration of ratifying a resolution approving a grant application to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development in the amount of $182,144 for a regional coordinated entry program as part of the 2016 Continuum of Care Program competition.
Move to ratify.
Had a motion by Ms. Trimmy, a second by Mr. Latour. Is there any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. B, consideration of approving 16, consideration of approving a resolution approving the submittal of a grant application in the amount of $87,397 to the Louisiana Governor's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness for the State Homeland Security Program Grant. Had a motion by Mr. Brame, second by Mr. Collins. Is there any discussion? Any objections?
You need a vice president?
I do. I do.
I'll send this form.
Any discussion? Hearing none, motion carries. I could comment on that, but I'm not going to. I'm going to try to be nice.
I know where you're going, but
Every Thursday.
I kind of needed one at the beginning of the meeting as well. 17, consideration of authorizing the
Move on
parish
17,
purchasing agent to
postpone.
advertise for bid
Second.
or utilize state purchasing contract procedures for the following. A, Central and Moss Bluff Library study room modifications and Central Library chiller replacement project. And B, the Burton elevator replacement project. Had a motion by Mr. Anderpont, second by Mr. Brame. Mr. Hunter.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Beam, is this normal stuff for us to take care of for the library board?
Well, because of the way, yes, the answer is yes. You have to approve that by state law because it's financial related purchase, and so it does have to go through you, but the board has approved all of that, and if you'd like, Dean Kelly can answer specifics on the actual project.
Is it because it's improvements on the building that we own?
Yes.
Okay, I understand. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Hunter. Mr. Anderpont?
thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Beam, we've brought this up before since we're talking about library. And you know how I feel about the number of members from the city of Lake Charles and we here. I still don't like it, and I don't know if there's anything we can do about it. Since we are legally the custodians of the libraries, I think it's disproportionate, and I've said that before, I'll say it again, and I'm not putting you on the spot, I'm just expressing an opinion, and I don't know how we go about getting that changed. But maybe one day you and I can sit down and talk about it with the legal counsel.
Sure.
Not trying to put words in your mouth, Mr. Gaff, but we do need you there. Is that agreeable, Brian?
Yes, sir. We have the information where we can show any of the jurors how those are appointed and catch anybody up who may not be.
Well, let me make it clear, it's not about the city of Lake Charles. I just think that since we have to put the tax on the ballot and we're responsible for them, I think that we should have the number of more number of members. I yield back.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Anderpont. We had a motion and a second on the floor. Is there any further discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. Item 18, take appropriate action on bids received by the parish purchasing agent for
Second.
lightweight aggregate. A motion by Mr. Anderpont, second by Mr. Brame. Any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. Item 19, consideration of adopting a resolution.
Move on 19,
approving
all bullets.
extensions to the following contracts related to standard bid items. A, Pumpelly Oil Acquisition LLC and Smitty Supply, Inc. for bulk oil for an additional 12-month period. Item B, Pumpelly Oil Acquisition for mosquito control solvents and products for an additional 6-month period. C, Pumpelly Oil for diesel fuel for an additional 12-month period. D, LM Daigle Oil Distributors and Pumpelly Oil for gasoline and diesel fuel for an additional 12-month period. E, Magnolia Pump and Equipment, Inc. for sewer pumps and related parts for an additional 12-month period. I had a motion by Mr. Brame, second by Mr. Collins. Is there any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. Item 20, consideration of accepting the 901 Lakeshore Drive
Second.
second floor modifications project as substantially complete. Got a motion by Mr. Collins and a second by Mr. Mr. Hunter. Is there any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. Item 21, take appropriate action on the terms of the following members of various boards and districts. A, Ms. Carrie
Like to move
Vick,
to defer for
Community
30
Center
days.
and
Second.
Playground District Number 7 of Ward 2. I have a motion to defer for 30 days by Mr. Latour and a second by Mr. Hunter. Is there any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. B, Mr. Terry Burns, resignation on the Community Center
Move to
and
appoint Mr.
Playground
Daniel
District Number
Palladino.
3 of Ward 7. I have a motion by Mr. Barris to appoint Mr. Daniel Palladino and a second by Mr. Farnham. Is there any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. C, Mr. James Laird's resignation on the Community Center and Playground District Number 3 of Ward 7.
Move to appoint Mr. Jonathan Harbert.
Second.
I have a motion by Mr. Barris to appoint Mr. Jonathan Harbert and a second by Mr. Farnham. Is there any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. C, Mr. James Laird, Community, no, we already did C, sorry. D, Mr. Jeremy Trahan, resignation on the Community Center and Playground District Number 3 of Ward 7.
Move to appoint Mr. Scott Spell.
Second.
I have a motion by Mr. Barris to appoint Mr. Scott Spell and a second by Mr. Collins. Is there any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. E, Mr. Ronald R. Harmon.
Move to reappoint Mr.
Ward
Harmon.
1 Fire Protection District Number 1. Have a motion to reappoint by Mr. White and a second by Mr. Collins. Is there any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. F, Mr. Robert Moss, resignation from the Ward 4 Fire Protection District Number 3.
Move to appoint Mr. Shane Boudreau.
Second.
Got a motion by Mr. Anderpont to appoint Mr. Shane Boudreau and a second by Mr. White. Is there any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. G, Mr. Lester Goff.
Move to
Ward
reappoint
4
Mr. Lester
Fire
Goff.
Protection District Number 3. Got a motion to reappoint by Mr. Anderpont and a second by Mr. White. Is there any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. H, we have a resignation by Mrs. Mildred White of Ward 5 Fire Protection District Number 1.
Yes, Midge served for many, many years, and has had some health issues and decided that she still goes to every meeting, but decided that it was time for her to step down as a board member, and they've submitted Catherine Barks to take Midge's place, and I think she'll do a wonderful job.
Okay, we have a motion from Ms. Trimmy to appoint Ms. Catherine Barks and a second by Ms. Mayo. Is there any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. I, Mr. Paul Geary,
Like to move
Ward
to
8
reappoint
Fire
Mr. Paul
Protection
Geary.
District Number 2. I have a motion to reappoint by Mr. Latour and a second by Mr. Collins. Is there any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. J, Mr. Jake Porche, Calcasieu Parish
Move to
Planning and
reappoint
Zoning
Second.
Board.
Porche.
I have a motion by Mr. Brame to reappoint and a second by Mr. Hunter. Is there any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. K, Mr. Jerry Navarre, Calcasieu Parish Planning and Zoning
Move to
Board.
reappoint.
I have a motion to reappoint by Mr. Anderpont and a second by Mr. Farnham. Is there any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. L, Mr. Elijah
I'd
Gilrey.
like to move to
Calcasieu
appoint
Parish
Mr. Randy
Planning
Armstrong.
and Zoning Board.
Second.
I have a motion by Mr. Latour to appoint Mr. Randy Armitage and a second by Mr. Brame. Mr. Gilrey.
I just want to say Mr. Elijah did a great job up there during this time, and he was really good. And so just want to thank Elijah for serving.
Thank you, Mr. Gilrery.
Thank you.
We had a motion and a second on the floor. Any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. M, Mr. Dick Myers' resignation from the Workforce Development
Second.
Board. I have a motion by Ms. Mayo to appoint Mr. Boyd Michael Welch. Is that correct, Ms. Mayo? And a second by Mr. Latour. Is there any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. N, Mr. Charles Broussard of the Vinton Harbor and Terminal District.
Move to submit the names of Mr. Charles Broussard and Mr. Kenneth Stinson as nominees.
Second.
Okay, I have a motion by Mr. Barris to submit the names of Mr. Charles Broussard and Mr. Kenneth Stinson as nominees, and a second by Mr. Farnham. Is there any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. Item 22, consideration of adopting a resolution of condolences to be forwarded to the family
Move
of the
on
late
22.
Edward S. Watson, former Calcasieu Parish Police Bureau and Mayor of the City of Lake Charles. I have a motion by Mr. Brame and a second by Mr. Hunter.
I don't know.
I'll say a few words.
Mr. Brame.
Ed was a good friend of mine. He was, lived in my district, and he was somebody that always, you know, was to me, was kind of soft-spoken and gave me, we didn't talk too much politics. I did know he was the past mayor of the city of Lake Charles. I did not know he was a police juror. But we had some great conversations. He'd always come to my shop and have coffee and visit, and, you know, he was always would talk and give me some, you know, direction on certain things, and I appreciated that. But Ed was a good guy, and I liked him, and he's going to be missed. So I appreciate that, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Brame. That was my first political campaign that I was involved in. I was in college. I put out signs for him. That's been a long time ago. Is there any further discussion?
I'd like to say a couple
Mr. Hunter.
Thank you, Mr. President. At Ed's funeral, Mayor Roach made a couple statements I thought were pretty poignant statements. First of all, I don't think Chenault would be at all what it is today if it weren't for Ed Watson, and I think that's worth people recognizing and remembering. And also, another thing that Mayor Roach said that really stuck with me was, you can tell a lot about a man in how he handles victory, and you can tell even more about a man in how he handles defeat. And Ed Watson was the type of guy that was a stand-up individual, both in times of victory and defeat. And this city would not be what it is today if it weren't for Ed Watson. And so as students of history and people that look back and realize that we are today where we are because of those that came before us, we need to remember that Lake Charles is much better off and a better city today because Ed Watson was a part of it. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Hunter. Is there any further discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. Before we adjourn, Mr. Gilrey, personal point of privilege.
Mr. Tom, if you could put that picture up. Yeah, I just want to say that had the opportunity, Brian DeLoach came in, the president of NACO, to Opelousas, and we had a meeting down there, and it was a very good meeting. Of course, you all see which one I am, but Brian is in the middle with the blue shirt. Those of you who don't know who the president is of the National Association, and Brian's from Florida. He's a good guy. We had a great meeting, and he's going to try to make his way to Lake Charles one day. So thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Gilrey. Which one's you?
The little curl hanging on the top.
Oh, yeah, okay, I see now. Mr. Hunter.
Thank you, Mr. President. Brian, I want to say I noticed that our website got redesigned, and I'm not sure when that happened, but it's great. And whoever did it did a very fine job, and it's much, much better with mobile devices than the old website was. So I don't know if we contracted out for that, but
Yes.
whoever did it did a really fine job. And it's very easy to use on the mobile device, so kudos. on
Thank you,
that
Mr.
front.
Hunter. We're doing, as people in your line of work would call a soft opening, I think. But Tom Hafer has guided that, and it's been updated. We thank you. He is going, I think, at maybe the meeting on the 20th of October, actually present to y'all. We wanted to get it out there and get anything, you know.
Some of the kinks worked out. Well,
So
good job,
thank you.
Tom. It's great. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Hunter. Item 23 was an advised item, one item for Ms. Trimming. Take notice of that. I need a motion to adjourn.
Second.
We are adjourned.
They had a second.